In this session, we are going to talk about exception handling. Exception handling is a feature that makes Java such a strong language. And if you are a developer, you're writing applications, or you're a student who are preparing for interviews, or you are writing exams, exception handling is important for you as well. Reason being, if you are a programmer, you will come across exception handling quite often. You have to be very much aware about the exceptions that we have and what are the various ways of exception for writing a good code. And if you're a student appear for interview or something like that, and you have written Java in your resume, there's a high probability that you will be getting a question from around exception handling. And in case you come from a C background and you're coming across this topic for the very first time, then this must be something new for you, and this exception handling is something that does not exist in C. So let's try to understand that what is exception handling, what is an exception, and what are the concepts that revolve around exception handling. So before we go on to understand this whole exception handling thing, first let's try to understand what is an exception. So let's say when you are writing a code, there are various things that can go wrong. And as the name itself says, exception. So whenever we use the word exception, we are talking about something that is different from normal, or I can say that is not normal. Okay, so we always have a scenario which is general or normal, then we have an exception. So here also we are talking about abnormality in a code. Whenever we have something that's not normal in a code, we say that is an exception. So that is one way you can understand this exception thing. So let's try to understand that what are the things that can go wrong in a Java code. Let's take 2-3 examples. So let's say we have a Java code in which we are trying to access a file and file does not exist. So we are trying to access a file and file does not exist. Or let's say we are trying to divide a number and we are dividing a number by 0. Or let's say we run out of memory. Or let's say I write a program, let's say I have an array which has 6 elements, and I try to print the 7th element. Let's say I try to print the 7th element. So these are some of the abnormalities that can occur in a code. So let me take this example, that what happens if we write something like this. So I want you to go and try and write it down. So you write a code. You have an array that contains 6 elements and you try to print the 7th element. So what happens in this case is that you get a message and let's say you get some line number. Okay, so let's try to understand what has happened here. So we had a code, we tried to access an index which does not exist, and when you run this, you get some message like this. Here in this case, this particular thing, array index out of bound exception, is an exception object. So what happens is that whenever there is some abnormal situation, Java throws an exception. So Java throws an exception. In this case, it has thrown this exception. So when I'm saying that Java throws an exception, I mean that Java throws an exception object. So this is an exception object. Using this, you get the information that what kind of exception has occurred. So as you can see, we have several exceptions that are there. We have several exception classes. Since here we are getting an exception, array index out of bound exception. So Java throws this exception object. So this is a scenario which happens when you write a buggy code. So till now we have been trying to understand what is an exception. So this is an exception. You write a code that is buggy Java gives you an object. Java throws an object. When I'm saying Java throws an object, you can think of this that Java gives you an object, exception object, that you have to deal with it. And dealing with this particular object is known as exception handling. So here in this case, we did not deal with it. We will see that what happens if we don't deal with an object, exception object, and what happens if we deal with it, and why is it necessary. But here, this is what's happening. We get an exception object. Whenever there is an error, Java throws an exception. We get an exception object. If we don't handle it, we get some error message. Now, before I proceed ahead to talk about the various ways to handle it and what happens if we don't handle an exception and what are the scenarios around it, now let's try to talk more about exceptions. So in the last slide, we came across an exception called arrays index out of bound exception. So now we will talk a bit more about exception. We will talk about hierarchy of exceptions. So all the exceptions that we have belong to a parent class called throwable. So throwable has two subclasses, exception and errors. So this is a very famous interview question, that what is the difference between errors and exception, and we will see this. People often get confused between the two. We will try and understand that what is the difference between errors and exception. So before that, let's proceed ahead with the hierarchy. So throwable has two subclasses, errors and exceptions. And exception is further divided broadly into two categories. First, we have runtime exception. Okay, it's a runtime. And then we have everything that is not a runtime exception. So it could be an IO exception. It could be a class not found exception. So there are various exceptions that are here. So the main difference between the two is that runtime exception generally occurs due to the programming error or due to the error of the programmer. For the example, array index out of bound exception is the mistake of a programmer. The programmer should know that, okay, I have just 6 elements, so the programmer should avoid to try to access the 7th element. Or for that matter, we have arithmetic exception. We saw divide by 0 thing. So divide by 0, if you're trying to divide something by 0, this is a programmer error. You should take care of that. So every such thing comes under runtime exception. These exceptions are generally not the programmer error. For that matter, IO exception, it might be the case that you are writing to a file or reading from a file and someone else deletes the file. So this is generally not the programmer's error. Your program was good, it's just that something has happened. So we have two categories. One is runtime exception. I'm talking broadly of two categories. One is runtime exception and rest are the exceptions that don't fall in the category of runtime exception. Okay, and in runtime exceptions, I've said before also, we have several exceptions. The array index out of bound exception, then we have arithmetic exception, and then we have few more exceptions. So as you go on to write more code and as you come across various exceptions, you will be coming across all these exceptions that we have. Now, since we have seen the hierarchy, this is the hierarchy. We have the parent class throwable, which has two subclasses, errors and exception. That exception is broadly categorized in two categories. First is runtime exception, and then everything that is not runtime exception. So runtime exception further has subclasses, array index out of bound arithmetic exception and exceptions like that.